So I will start this second course, and I will start with a short recap of the session of last time. So the way I talk about biology is mainly in order to understand current living beings theoretically, and that is to say, the main question is how we should define them, how we should address them in everyday biology, in a sense, and also how we should write them in scientific papers, both modeling papers or experimental papers. Now, the critical claim, in a sense, of the last session was that the reference to the past is a necessary component in the way we should write about biological objects. And so it's a necessary component to study current living beings. And here I emphasize that it's a major difference with respect to the epistemology of physics, where abstract mathematical equations, objects, are the main way we write about phenomena. So again, about the way I address this question, it's by use of epistemology and theory. So theory in biology, which can mean mathematics, but also can mean also just concepts, depending on the cases. I also do a lot of comparisons with the way to theorize in physics and in biology. And my focus, again, is really on what we could call the flesh of sciences. That is to say, what are the existing practices and what are the new practices, the possible future practices that could develop on the basis of this kind of discussion. Now, if we go back to the relation with physics, this relation between physics and biology is sometimes a little bit messed up, especially by physicists, but also by biologists. Why? Because there is a bit of a confusion between different notions. The first one is that there are interfaces between physics and biology. For example, if we talk about the motion of a cell or of an organism, then we need to discuss it in the vocabulary and by having in mind classical mechanics. Motion in classical mechanics requires forces. So that's an interface between physics and biology. But sometimes physicists also say that when they model, for example, swarms, when they model flocks of birds or a school of fishes, that this modeling is just physics, or and they do this modeling by means of statistical mechanics. Another example is modeling morphogenesis in development by means of hydrodynamics. And those modeling, they don't use elementary components like fishes or birds that are described by physics, but they use models that come from physics. So what I want to emphasize here is that analogy, transfer of models from one field to another, is not just physics. And there is no physics principle that tells you that a fish will behave statistically like an atom. So these analogies are at the same time very interesting and fruitful, especially to assess collective behaviors. But they're also dangerous and should be assessed critically, which the statement is just physics does not enable researchers to do. Now, of course, my main means of articulating physics and biology is mainly the comparison between the methodology and the epistemology in the two fields. And in that regard, physics is very interesting because it's a field also in which there is a mastery in the use of mathematics and in the discussion of the underlying assumptions. Now, to make a small recap of last session, maybe the main point that I want to emphasize is that there are two very distinct schema to define theoretical objects and to enable us to understand them. The first is the one of physics, and it's based on causal relations that are written on the basis of invariants and symmetries. And in this case, we can produce abstract definition of objects by mathematics. And the second schema that is used in the classification of living beings is primarily historical. It's based on relativeness and the underlying idea of genealogy. And again, the groups in the classification that are acceptable are groups that are the descent of a theoretical common ancestor. So here, the invariant is not a mathematical causal structure. It's the past, the theoretical common ancestor, and also concrete objects, the specimens that are used to define groups. Once we have that, then there are specific challenges that emerge. And that is to say, how should we articulate these two epistemologies? So the relational historical epistemology of physics on the one side, and the historical epistemology that is used to define objects in biology, in systematics, but also in everyday practice, in experiments. And this articulation leads to several stakes. First, it's a matter of coherence in scientific discourse on biological objects. But it's also a way to clarify what we really know when we are studying an object, including by means of mathematics or by means of biophysics. So it's a way to clarify what we know, what we do not know, but also what we cannot know. And in sciences, it's a hallmark, let's say, of clarity when we can state that there are things that we cannot know. And it is the case in physics, it is the case in computer sciences. And there is only one part in biology where it's a mainstream notion that there are things that we cannot know. It's in the classification. The last common ancestor of a group is something that we cannot know. We cannot specify what specific organism it is, at least in the classification, because we have no access to the specific genealogy between the organisms. But in the study of organisms, like in physiology, like in development and so on, we are missing a bit on these questions. Now, a last aim, of course, and as I mentioned earlier, is to develop new practices in biology by articulating these two epistemologies. And that's something that I will come to today. But first of all, what I want to do is to provide you an overview of a way we can construct theoretical objects in biology and how the epistemology of this could work. And then I will move towards the question of new possibilities, which is a key concept if we want to understand historically biological objects. And last, I will come to the question of disruptions in biology as an application of some of the abstract ideas that I will present today. If we again recap a little bit what I said last time, what do we have in physics that we can, in biology, that we can build on to create a theoretical framework? Well, we have these definitions that use the reference to the past, that are the basis of the classification and also of everyday experiment description. We have also things that we could call biological constraints. What is the idea underlying this notion? Biological constraints are basically local invariants, like, for example, the geometry of the bones of my arm when I'm moving, that are invariant for a time, but that can change in the next generation or even just over time. And these invariants shape processes of transformation, like my motion, it's shaped by my bones. And at the same time, they are not altered in the process that they shape. And of course, we have a few free invariants, in a sense, that come from physics. For example, the conservation of atoms or the gravitational field. But actually, in practice, there are always things that we can bicker on concerning these invariants, and you can ask me questions if you want an example on that. The notion, the concept that I didn't discuss last time that is critical is this concept of constraint. And the idea with this concept is to recover, at least to some extent, what physics and physics view can bring in biology. As I said, constraints are invariants, local invariants that shape a process of transformation and play a causal role as such. But they are only valid at a time scale. They are part of a historical process. What is important is that they should not be confused with concrete objects. For example, I mentioned the shape of my bones, and I'm not saying just my bones. So the idea is to have a bit of theoretical accuracy and conceptual accuracy here. And so the aim also is for constraints to be the basis of mathematical modeling. And in a sense, with this concept, you can already reinterpret what physicists are doing when they are doing mathematical modeling in biology. That is to say, the hypotheses that they use, the hypotheses of invariants that are required to do mathematical modeling, are hypotheses on constraints that will be relevant for biological objects at a given time. So some examples of constraints are my bones, as I said. Enzymes are typically constraints acting on chemical processes. And muscles are also constraints to an extent with respect to the motion of my arm, for example. But here we have to be very specific. There are those aspects of the muscles that do not change, that are the constraints during motion. And you have also in the muscles energy stores that are consumed during motion. So the constraints are really those parts that can be described with more precision, of course, that are conserved during the motion, and that are, of course, constraining the motion, the release of energy from the muscle and more generally from the blood during motion. So constraints is really a critical concept for me and for a larger group that is called the organism group, who worked and still work on trying to sketch, to build, to develop a theory of organisms. Now, if we again go back to physics, there is a key point is that in a sense, physics understands changes based on invariance. I hinted to that already last time. But the idea is that physics primarily understands changes as motion in a predetermined space, and this space and this motion are structured by symmetry and invariance. By contrast, in biology, if we assume, if we posit the primacy of historicity, then we cannot understand objects like in physics, and we should theorize differently. And in a sense, the way we stated that is by positing something that we call the principle of variation. So we being the organism group. And the idea of the principle of variation is to state that biological objects in general cannot be considered as generic objects, like in physics, but by contrast are specific objects. So objects that cannot be theorized as a generic outcome based on abstract constraints invariance. And now you can also reconsider a little bit why I emphasize the phylogenetic method of classification so much last time. In a sense, the phylogenetic method is a way to classify scientifically specific objects. That is to say, objects that you cannot define by their invariance, symmetries, and thus by causal mathematical structure. Now, with the principle of variation, we are still left with a question on the task to do, which is to rethink the role of mathematics in biology. That is to say, we still would like to build in biology on the power of mathematics in order to put together parts that are interacting. For example, during morphogenesis, where cells move and at the same time act on the extracellular matrix, and reciprocally the extracellular matrix act on cells, or if you take the example of school of fishes that I mentioned above, well, the fishes in a school are interacting, and this interaction cannot be analyzed just conceptually. So we need to have a way to use this power of mathematics, but we need to articulate it with this concept that biological objects are ultimately specific objects, that is to say, objects that cannot be defined as generic ones, like in physics. Now I will provide a short sketch of the emerging epistemology that comes with this concept. So in biology, variation and historicity come first. That's the principle of variation. Then stability comes second. And the underlying concept for stability is this concept of constraints that I already introduced. But then this stability needs some explanation. Even though the stability is relative, it's for a time, it still needs an explanation. And it's to be contrasted again with physics, where the stability of physics law is typically postulated. It's an assumption, and then we derive stuff from this assumption. Here in biology, the idea is that stability needs explanation. And there are actually at least two ways to explain stability, and they are complementary. They are not in contradiction. The main one is natural selection. Indeed, natural selection by itself does not explain variation at all. Natural selection explains why some part of a population lasts, whereas another part disappears. So natural selection is primarily an explanation of stability. And actually, that's underlined by Darwin himself in the subtitle of The Origin of Species. That is to say, Darwin states, the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Now, if some of you know well Darwinism, it's over time that natural selection can play a role in making some specific situation emerge. But if you look at the principle itself, its application is only about the preservation of some elements. Now, what I say may look a bit abstract, but you can think of it also in a bit of an interpretation of what is going on during evolution. For example, some genes and the sequence of some genes are relatively well conserved in evolution. And why is that? It's mostly because variation of these genes, or even the disappearance of these genes, will lead to the death or the lack of the ability to reproduce for a given organism. So some variations are not possible or are not sustained in evolution because they are not compatible with life. And that's the underlying reasoning when we understand that there is some genetic aspect, for example, or some traits, more generally, that are well conserved in evolution. So natural selection is really, firstly, a way to explain the relative stability of parts of organisms, so I will say constraints in this general framework. Now, there is another at shorter time scale way to understand the stability. Let's say, again, for the shape of my bones, it's a mutual maintenance between the parts of an organism. And that's what tradition in theoretical biology called organization. Now, before developing a little bit more this concept, I just want to emphasize that actually these two ways to explain stabilities are also two ways, philosophical ways, to interpret functions in biology. That is to say, to natural selection corresponds the notion of etiological functions. That is to say, etiological functions are typically objects that are function because they have been selected due to their consequences. And the second is organization. And organization emphasizes circularity, so interdependencies between parts, but that shape that leads to circular interdependencies, so that actually something like my art, for example, can depend on its consequence through the rest of the organization. And again, here, and as I mentioned for physics, there is an interesting articulation to have in mind here with physics, is that from the point of view of thermodynamics, biological objects are objects that are far from thermodynamic equilibrium, so they have to sustain themselves actively by producing entropy and by having flows of energy with respect to the outside of the organism. But this aspect of biological situations is coupled with the idea that on top of that, their structure can change over time. If you take a flame, for example, the structure of the flame does not change over time. It's once the flame emerges, its structure is kind of fixed. By contrast, over time, living being organization change. So here you can have an articulation between this question of variation and stability with thermodynamics. Now, So organization can be seen in many ways. There is a whole tradition that is focused on that. It goes through Kant, and more recently in theoretical biology, Kaufman, Varela, and Rosen. So Varela and Maturana defined autopoiesis, for example, the notion that living beings can be seen as network of processes that reproduce their condition of existence. Kaufman defines autocatalytic sets, that is to say, sets of chemicals that would reproduce their constituents by catalysis, but that will be seen as something collective and not just pointwise catalysis like in elementary chemical reaction. And Rosen defines things more abstractly with MR systems, metabolism and repair systems. I won't dwell on it, but the point is that there is a whole tradition around this notion of organization. My main contention with it is that it has a difficulty to articulate itself with the question of historicity. And in a sense, when there are some mathematics in this tradition, organization is typically seen as a fixed point. That is to say, something that will maintain itself identically over time. And its fixed points are interesting mathematically because it enables you actually to do mathematics to see what is going on next to the fixed point. But it's not the case in biology in general that living things maintain themselves identically over time. Just as a side remark, I told you a lot about genericity last time, and I mentioned it this time too. And it's a critical question for the origin of life. And for example, Kaufman, when working on these autocatalytic sets, showed that mathematically it was a generic property of random sets of interacting molecules to contain autocatalytic sets. So from this point of view of genericity, then life would be a necessary thing once there are enough chemicals interacting. So that's just to exemplify this power of the notion of genericity. But at the same time, it's not a generic property of a random soup of chemical to yield to this mouse, this tree, or these living beings that we see now and that we have to understand. And here, that's an issue of specificity that pops out. Now, I just wanted to explain a little bit the closure of constraints, because that's a concept that we coined with Matteo Mosio, and it was really in this context of having biological objects being historical objects, and in order to understand some level, let's say, of stability that exists in living beings, and by building on the tradition that I mentioned. And the idea behind this concept is to say that, well, constraints, let's say C3 here, act on the process of transformation. So C3 here act on the process of transformation that produces another constraint that acts itself on another process that produces another constraint, C4, and that itself acts on a process that maintains C3. And here you have a circularity, which is between constraints, and at the same time, the system is completely open. It's open to the element A, 3, 2, and 4 that come from outside and that are used to maintain these constraints. It's also open to an external constraint C5 that could be from of ecological origin, or even could be from physics, for example, invariant from physics. And the idea in closure of constraints was really not to state that the constraints involved in closure will be sufficient to understand how the living being lasts over time, that is to say, how it sustains itself. It was really to show that there is some level of autonomy in a soup of interdependencies, if you will. But sometimes it has been misunderstood, and to this end, we went further in the specification of closure of constraints. So in this specification, middle point was this schematic, which is now a more complete, in a sense, way to describe theoretical objects in biology. And below, I will specify it even further. So here, what do you have? You have specific objects. So objects that cannot be defined like in physics. What defines them is history, it's a context, and the context over time. And in these specific objects, you can point out some constraints. So for example, my bones, my cholesterol level, or whatever. Any kind of regularities that you want that are part of these specific objects, but that are insufficient to define it. And then over time, well, these constraints can change, new constraints can appear, and the context can change also and be relevant to understand the situation. And this will be a schematic of what we call the structure of determination of biological objects, with historicity and context that play an irreducible role. By irreducible, I mean irreducible to a mathematical object, and still constraints that can be figured out, experimented on, used to do mathematics, but that need always to be read as associated with specific objects. So this discussion, again, may seem a little bit abstract, but actually it's really not. If you think about any kind of mathematical model that is done to describe morphogenesis in chicken, to follow up on a last course, well, physicists have to state that they're working on chicken, and this chicken come from some animal farm and so on. So those are ways to define specific objects as such, and they do not use the means of physics. And then the physicist states, well, this chemical concentration over space, or the stiffness of a matrix or whatever are relevant to understand the process of morphogenesis. And here we are discussing at the level of constraints. So again, this way, in my view, of looking at things is more coherent, is more precise when we are talking about what scientists can actually do and can actually say when they are doing sciences, at least in biology. Now, the former schematic, well, it remains a schematic with specific objects being just a word in a schema. To go beyond that, and also to overcome the shortcomings of the closure of constraints schematic that I showed you, we introduced recently a new symbol, which is the Greek word chi, or key. I'm not sure about the accent in English. And the idea with this new symbol is to have to write something that is not a mathematical object. It's not a variable, but it's really a symbol. And what does it mean to be a symbol? It means that it connects two distinct things. Here it connects a formalism with concrete objects that needs ultimately to be pointed as these objects And so here again, you have to recall the role that specimens have in the classification. That is to say, in the classification, the names refer always to a type, what is called a type. That is to say, a specimen that is kept typically in universities or a museum of natural history. So, but Kai can also point to, let's say, a specimen in an animal farm for a specific strain of laboratory animal. But really the idea is that this object, this writing is not about mathematics. It's not a formal object. It is a symbol. And now you can introduce this symbol to make schematics of, for example, here what will be an experiment where a common ancestor here can lead to different specimens that are described as being the same Kai, but can still have some variation in the constraints involved. And that's the variability that pops out in basically all biological experiments. Now, I won't dwell too much on it, but the idea is that this way of writing things, which is quite new, is not just meant to enhance the theoretical accuracy of how we write or how we talk about biological objects. It's also something that is meant to be practical. And one example of that is that if you take the idea that functions are defined by the closure of constraints, so that is to say these circular interdependencies, then there are some functions that you cannot accommodate. Those are the functions that require a novelty to appear. So it happens a lot in the brain, for example, or in the immune system, where it's not constraints that are there that play a functional role. Constraints make sense with respect to the future or with respect to the emergence of something new. Another good example of that is the mutator system that you may have heard about in bacteria. The idea is that bacteria that are under stress tend to shrink their ability to correct mutation. And the interpretation of that is that by mutating more, they explore more possibilities. And this way, maybe can find a variation that would shrink this stress that they are subjected to. And then you have something that is ahistorical, the mechanism that the mutator mechanism that suppress the repair mechanisms. And you have something that is purely diachronic and completely unpredictable, which are the mutation that can be functional for the bacteria. So this kind of variation cannot be addressed with an ahistorical view on biological organization, and using Kai can help to address them. So Kai has two theoretical functions or two epistemological functions that are distinct and at the same time complementary and addressed in a sense in one move. The first one is to accommodate the known aspects of the object that come from its history. So if you take any kind of living beings, it embeds variations that appeared in the past that biologists typically don't know about. And when biologists practice, they focus on some function and leave aside a lot of the other functions. Some of them are completely unknown. So Kai enables to address that. But the second epistemological role of Kai is really to accommodate the indeterminacy due to the object, the biological object, continuing to generate a history by generating novelty. And of course, the two things are coupled. It's because the object continues to generate novelty over time. And I showed you last time the phylogeny of laboratory mouse. So mice that have been for generations in a control context, and they still generate novelties that can be significant experimentally. So the two things are connected because of that, and it's really also the reason why people in systematics use this historical epistemology. So that's the two main functions of Kai. I will switch this part, and we can have a small question part, and then we can make the break before I move on.
So this model of constraints, and can you hear me?
Yes,
you can, right? Yeah. So it looks very appealing, but the question is how far back in the history of life it is fairly plausible and useful. And this is why I'm asking it. Let's suppose that a model like Kaufman's model is correct. So that we have some kind of a pre-metabolic network of molecules that do not really reproduce. They do not replicate, but rather sort of reproduce, sort of roughly reproduce within the network, and these networks also reproduce roughly. And then if we want to, and maybe that was the sort of the first stage of life, or maybe very late abiogenetic sort of a network from which code sprang, and then replication of molecules and so on. So let's suppose something like that is correct. Now, if we analyze that sort of network, then it's very hard to say that any generic constraints or general constraints in that network define the network, because the whole point is that it's very diverse, although it is a kind of a fairly tight network. The molecules are diverse, the connections between them are diverse, even though they reproduce and then continue reproducing. So it seems that what's dominant at that stage is actually what you are talking about when you symbolize it with chi, right? That's what's going on. The constraints are sort of a second order importance. Only later on, when you have streamlined molecules like RNA or something like that, that replicate and then like do it in a very precise way, as they do now, and as life exists now, we can say that the constraints are well defined. So where do you think is the sort of do you think that there is a cutoff line of that sort if metabolism first or pre-metabolism first theory of the origin of life is adequate?
First point is that for me to be defined, constraints need not to be individualized in a sense. So let me take an example. If you have a network that exists, but let's say its structure remains invariant, but the nature of its constituents varies. So, for example, for a time, in this, if you draw the network, in this node, there is a chemical A, and after that, it's chemical B, and after that, it's chemical C, but they all do the same thing in the network. Then you can understand it generically. So in a sense, from the point of view of the network, the constraint remains the same. So, and this move is that comes from physics really, and whenever you can figure out a level where things become generic, then you go for it in physics. So it can be, for example, in classical mechanics, people started to work on trajectories, trying to predict trajectories and so on. But for chaotic dynamics, it's not possible. So instead of that, they're working on collections of trajectories and looking at generic properties of these collections of trajectories. So in a sense, that's just to specify a bit more the concept of constraints. Now, for me, let's say, if we are talking about biology, the notion of being old is a critical one. To say all living beings, to our knowledge, that exist currently, come from lineages that are more than 1 billion years old. They are roughly 3 billion years old. And it's not benign. It's not a minor thing. Actually, I will show you a little bit later how the fact of being the outcome of a long history shape the organization of living beings, and that's not made explicit just by the notion of closure of constraints. Now, if you include in the notion of a living being the fact of being old, then something very interesting pops out, interesting philosophically and scientifically. It's that there is no starting point to being old. It's something that really happens in a process. So in this sense, there is no origin of life, for example, even though there was a time where there was no life, and there is a time when there is life. But between the two, there is no origin. There is a long process of emergence. Now, methodologically, and to address really more precisely your question, I would say, at least at this step, what matters is what is it that you can do with Kai. If we are talking about current living beings, Kai really can be structured theoretically by genealogies and by more precisely by phylogenies. So Kai plays a useful role in a sense to connect relational descriptions about constraints, the process act on, and so on, and genealogical or historical descriptions that are used to define the objects that we are working with. So I think, in a sense, this somewhat pragmatic criterion can shape things. I will focus on now on a specific aspect of historicity, which is at the same time really the building block of what I call historicity. And this aspect is the appearance of novelties in biology, and more specifically, the notion of new possibilities. So this notion of new possibilities is to a large extent foreign in physics, and at the same time, it's really an element of biology. For example, when I mentioned when I discussed the classification, the initial way to do the classification was by using novelties and shared novelties between different organisms. So in the discussion on evolution, novelties and new possibilities are a critical notion. At the same time, it has not been theorized as such and not used in modelization as such, except a little bit recently. For example, the models in evolution are mostly based on population genetics, and in population genetics, the idea is to use as assumption existing genes, their fitness, and then to derive the consequences of these assumptions. So novelties are not modeled as such. So here is an example of novelty, the appearance of jaws, which enable the appearance of teeth, and teeth can be used for many different purposes, grabbing prey, cutting prey, in the case of piranha here, or crushing food. And here the key idea is that if we talk about constraints and their inscription inside an organization, there is a diversity of ways. The constraints that are built on the articulated jaws can be inscribed in organization. And to the right, you can see an alternative use of jaws, which is to protect juveniles and not just to eat food. And this is a typical example of exaptation, the change of function in a body part. And it's, again, a hallmark of historicity. And if we talk about mathematization, the way we can model, for example, how the jaw of piranha work is not the same, and it won't use the same parameters. And the way we will model the jaw of that is used to catch prey, or the jaw which is used to squash clams, for example. So from a mathematical point of view, all these novelties goes with a change in mathematical description or description space or possibility space. That's why I emphasize this notion of new possibilities. So Goffman worked a lot on this notion, actually, with the notion of adjacent possible. And the idea is that there are things that exist, and there are possibilities that are close to what exists, but do not yet exist as such. And then, over time, the biosphere, for example, or a species will explore possibilities like that. And Goffman is very clear that these new possibilities cannot be prestated. That's actually a paper that we wrote together in 2012. Tentative to model a little bit mathematically this notion is by the means of urns. And so drawing balls from an urn. And the idea is that if we fall on a ball whose color already has been used, then we just add balls of this color. That's what is modeled here. That is to say, we already went through this color, so we just add more of it. But then if we find a color that we never access to before, and that will be here, that will be the possibilities. Here it's actualizing a possibility that exists as a possibility but was not actualized before. Then we add also balls of new colors, and that will be adding new possibilities to the system. So it's a crude, very simple modeling of this notion, but it enables to do mathematics. And at the same time, there is a deep epistemological problem, is that if you want to model that, you already have to predefine what these new colors will do. So in a sense, they are not new for the modeler. And here again is a matter of genericity that we discussed a little bit. It is to say, the idea is that these new colors actually behave like any of the previous colors that exist, in the sense that they can enable the appearance of these and that colors. They follow actually the same rules that any all other colors. And it's not the case in biology. Even if we talk about population genetics, for example, the way reproduction takes place genetically change over time. So the equations of population genetics actually are based on constraints, and these constraints are not physics invariant, they change over time. Living beings can go from being haploid to being diploid to being sometimes more than that, and switch from sexual reproduction to asexual and so on. So there is an epistemological problem here, and it's actually as if you have this dynamic of urns, which will be a dynamic of possibilities. And here you have a urn who would contain all possible possibilities beforehand. So it's just a complexification of possibilities, building a dynamic, but without addressing the epistemological problems that these new balls may behave completely differently, and that's where the unpredictability lies. So here the epistemological issue is really between an abstract mathematical space and between the concept of having new possibilities, and the question is how we should objectivize these new possibilities. I will go fast on that, but just again to emphasize that the crucial notion is not just this notion of mathematical space, but it's really the notion of genericity versus specificity. And for that, I will use an example that is not actually from biology, but something that is very common to everyday life, that is to say, just text. So there is a sense in which we can understand text in a generic way as a sequence of symbols and symbols from a predefined set. And this way to understand text is useful. For example, it's useful for to build softwares. It's useful for printers, to design printers, to construct them. And in this sense, text can be seen as a generic sequence of symbols. And when programming a word processor or when building a printer, you want to be able to print any text, and you want to be able to type any text. So that's a generic understanding of text. And at the same time, where you are confronted with a text, let's say a scientific paper, it's not any text. It's the specific sequence of this text that has meaning, that requires work, and sometimes a lot of work. If you take into account costly experimental apparatus, some relatively short texts can require millions of euros to produce, right? Here, it's really to contrast this notion of genericity and specificity. Now, if we talk about possibilities, in a sense, all text, and that's really Leibniz's idea, and it's also in the notion of the Library of Babel, all text can be seen just as sequence of symbol, right? And the Library of Babel is the idea that in a library there would be all possible text. But it is not really what is meaningful. What is meaningful is that this specific text exists and has been produced, for example, by an experimenter doing an experiment, or by a philosopher thinking in a specific way. And the meaning that is attached to this text is not given by the mathematical space of all possible sequences. The meaning of the text is given in association with other texts, with an history, but also in relation with the world. For example, in philosophy, in phenomenology specifically, experiments on oneself are a crucial notion. Or and of course, in experimental sciences, the outcome of an experiment is also a crucial notion that endows the text with meaning. So if you want to address the meaning of text, you have to change your space of understanding. And here I'm being a bit metaphorical because it's not obvious that the meaning of text can be mathematized in such a way. But my key point is that the meaning of text as specific sequences endowed with meaning, whatever meaning means, requires a broadening, a broader view than just the mathematical space of possible sequences. And that's from this perspective that you can understand how new possibilities can emerge also in biology. That is to say, if you take the mathematical space, let's say, of the position of all atoms at the beginning of the Earth, then you have endowed with the equations of classical mechanics, you would have a crude model in a generic mathematical space of whatever will happen on Earth. But this description does not provide anything, because what matters are the properties, the specific properties of living beings that emerge from a point of view in this space. And that's where we can define a notion of new possibilities that is not just based on the idea that the space of possibility changes, but it is based on genericity and specificity. So the idea is that new possibilities are not generic consequences of an initial situation, and in this sense are specific. And in biology, their contribution to the organization stems from this specificity. So the idea is that something is completely improbable or even not possible before it appears. But it's not just that, it's not just improbable, because improbable things occur all the time, and it's sufficient to launch several dice to have an improbable outcome. What matters is that the causal role of this improbable configuration is attached, or is a consequence of its specificity. And in a sense, what I'm going to talk to you about now is really based on this idea, and it's an application to understand what is going on in the Anthropocene with respect to the living. That's to say, how living beings are disrupted in the Anthropocene. Disruptions are more and more described in biology. So that's a bibliometry of the occurrence of the word disruption in papers. I think it's in ecology. Over time, and as you can see, in proportion, it goes from being from being around 2% of the papers that mention disruptions to being 15% of the papers. And at the same time, the term of disruption has not been theorized as such in biology. For example, in ecology, people talk about disturbance or perturbation being a technical concept from physics. So a technical concept that is valid for ahistorical systems. And there is a special case where a more explicit discussion took place in the case of endocrine disruptors, those chemicals that interfere with hormone action. And here the word disruption has been used for a specific reason and against alternatives like modulation or perturbation. So as examples of disruption, there is endocrine disruptor, but there is one that I will mostly build on, which is the case of plant pollinator networks, and in the context of global warming. And that is an example in ecology. Now, if you want to understand disruptions in biology, my key claim is that we need a theory of biological organization, because disruptions are, that's an assumption, will be disruptions of organization. And in a sense, then would be kind of disorganizations. And again, that's where all my previous discussion come forth. My hypothesis is that to understand disruption, you need at the same time systemic reasoning to understand the organization and how an interference or a perturbation of this organization becomes something more than just a perturbation. And also historical reasoning, because actually it's history that shape these organizations, and it's with having that in mind that we will understand how disruptions take place. Here I could describe briefly a picture of what is going on with living being, and it's something that is very different from what takes place in typical physics situation. The idea is that living beings go from singular to singular situations, that's to say situations that are always very improbable if you have some probabilities. And again, and that's in the notion of novelty that I presented, their organization is based the organization is based on the novelty of the past, which means that the organization is based on things that are improbable and at the same time that are functional because they are improbable. Then disruption could just be the randomization, or in a sense, the genericization of parts of biological organization. This is to say, if you assume that the parts of living beings have a functional role in as much as they are improbable, then if you randomize them, make them more probable, the functionality of these parts vanishes to an extent, right? So let's use a specific example, and as I mentioned, it's the case of plant pollinator networks in ecology. So in ecology, this kind of populations, plant and pollinators, have seasonal activities. That is to say, the plant flower at a specific time in spring, and pollinator wake up or hatch at a specific time in spring too. And the point is that the climate change changes these activity periods. And you know, if every population would shift in an uniform way, then climate change will not change interactions. Everything will take place earlier in spring, and that will be it. But it's not the case at all. And what happens is that the shifts in climate change are actually quite random. So the histograms are empirical data. And it's relatively easy to understand why. It's that different species use different clues to wake up in spring. So it can go from the photoperiod, that is to say the duration of the day, and it's something that does not change with climate change. Temperature, which is something that changes. The presence of snow. It can be also the temperature of the air, temperature of soils, etc. So the clues are diverse, and the response to climate change are diverse too, which means that the different organizations get the different species get desynchronized. And this desynchronization leads some species to be in a difficult position. So, for example, if you have here initially a pollinator that get plants to pollinate and to feed on during its whole activity period initially, the random changes can lead to a situation where there are gaps where the pollinator do not have anything to feed on. And this can lead to the disappearance of pollinators. And it's a complementary explanation to other explanations like chemical pollutions, for example. But what I want to emphasize is underlying reasoning. So it's that was done by Memmott, but it's really a whole subfield of ecology that works on this question. The underlying reasoning is the following. So the initial situation is specific with respect to activity periods. That is to say, the initial situation before climate change is a situation where all populations in the ecosystem are viable. And this is extremely improbable. I worked on the models, and it's extremely improbable configurations. But this specific configuration has a systemic meaning. That is to say, it's a configuration where all populations are viable, right? Now, what happens is that maybe a step that is not in the slide is that this specific configuration is only possible or is only explainable thanks to history. It's a configuration that appear over time in history. What you have to keep in mind is that an improbable situation, non-generic situation in physics have to be explained. You cannot go with any improbable thing. Otherwise, you will be able to explain everything with just a small mathematical setup. So it's historicity that justify that the specific configuration came to be. Now, what happens is that in the disruption, this specific configuration becomes more random or more generic, if you prefer, and is less viable. It's less viable because some population are missing, have periods without anything to feed on, for example. And so what I want to emphasize here is that we are in a situation where historicity is critical to understand the situation. Why? Because the initial situation is specific, it's completely improbable, and you cannot assume arbitrarily that improbable situation came to be. And at the same time, you need this systemic reasoning, that is to say, how the components of the ecosystem mutually maintain each other. So here you have a schematic of the situation that is relatively simple. There is an historicity, there is an history of the ecosystem that complexified by aggregation and by the evolution of the different species that are part of this ecosystem. And the history of this ecosystem took place in a situation with some seasonal cues that enable the different populations to synchronize themselves. And now with climate change, you have a disruption of the effect of the seasonal cues on the synchronization, and that leads to a loss of the viability of population in the ecosystem. I just want to emphasize that schematic for what happens here is that maybe I just go here. If you draw here the number of species that will disappear for the different possible activity periods, you see that the most likely configuration is situation where around 220 species disappear. So that's simulations that I've done. And the idea is that the situation where nothing disappears is extremely improbable. It's in this corner here. And here I've done 1 million iteration of the simulation, and it's not something that you can find with 1 million iteration. So again, it's more something like 10 power to the 200, I think, for this ecosystem. So it's when I say that it's extremely improbable, I mean it. But the idea here is really to try to theorize on this kind of situation, where really situations, let's say the different possibilities are put together depending on their their role in a system, or more generally in an organization. So this is done with the concept of entropy and Boltzmann entropy, but I won't dwell too much on that. What I just want to emphasize is that here the situation where everything is viable is the smallest situation, that is to say the most improbable situation. And what happens is that if there is a randomization of activity periods, the system will typically find itself here, for example, where less species are viable, where less population in the ecosystem are viable. And what happens once you are in this situation? Well, the populations that are not viable disappear. So what does it mean that they disappear? It means that part of the possibility space disappears too, right? Because you have one less species in the ecosystem, so you have one less parameter, which is the activity period corresponding to these species. And the result is that of part of the possibility space collapses, and which leads to this situation where the possibilities are less numerous. And it's, in a sense, that's exactly the opposite of the appearance of new possibilities. That is to say, here it's a disappearance of possibilities. So my point is that from a mathematical perspective, there are two things here that are interesting. One is that there is a bit of a metric notion of improbability of the viable situation. And at the same time, there is a more geometric notion of a space that can expand or shrink here. And here it is shrinking. The point is that complexification in evolution will be the opposite. Of course, it's going from this to this, and that will mean adding possibilities on the one side, and also going towards less probable situation. Actually, it enables you to see a little bit two interesting things. First, here we are in log scale, so we are talking about possibilities that are 1 over 2 power 1500. So that's what I meant by extremely unlikely. But the second thing is that there are parameters that impact the outcome of the situation. And these two parameters are one for robustness, that is to say how much pollinators can sustain themselves even though they cannot feed during their complete activity period. And the other one would be resilience, A, which corresponds to the ability of pollinators to feed on plants that they did not use to feed on. And what is interesting is that robustness impacts the viability for relatively small randomization of activity periods here. So here you have zero robustness, and here you have a higher robustness. And on the opposite, resilience has the activity to create new relationship to feed on new plants for pollinators. Impact what happens when activity periods are completely randomized. And here you see. So here it's with a high resilience. So that is just to illustrate a little bit how this concept can come into play. Now we can formulate the first concept of disruption in biology. So if we assume that history has produced singular configurations that are viable thanks to their singularity, the two things really need to be coupled, then disruption replaces it with a more random or more generic, if you prefer, configuration that is also less viable precisely because there is this coupling between being singular and being viable. So then, in a sense, disruptions in biology will be the randomization, partial randomization, of course, of biological organization. And it works actually very well, this concept with endocrine disruptors. What do endocrine disruptors do? So again, endocrine disruptors are chemicals that interfere with hormone action. Well, what they do is that they randomize the effect of hormones with respect to what they did in the previous generations. And this randomization leads to a disorganization of development, so that, for example, with diethyl estrol, it's the uterus that is disorganized and has difficulty sustaining a child, or and can have cancer later on. Or if we talk about thyroid hormones, it's brain development that is a bit randomized, so that there is less neuron, less myelinization, and so on. So in both cases, it's loss of functionality that goes with the disruption. And in both cases, it comes from the fact that biological organization appeared over time, and in a sense, are not do not display generic robustness. For example, if an engineer builds a device, he wants the device to work in a range of all situations that can be encountered. Let's say for this device, let's say a car on the road, it needs to work well, whether it's raining, whether there is dust, sand on the road, or whatever. It's not the case for biological organization. They are sustaining themselves only in situations that they have encountered in the past and that are not forgotten. So, for example, situations where there is a lot of halogens, complex molecule with halogens, which is the colon of iodine, were not encountered in the past because there are very few biomolecules that contain halogens, but there are a lot of industrial molecules that contain them. And since the few biological molecules that contain halogens are thyroid hormones, then there are a lot of industrial molecules that are endocrine disruptors because they contain halogens. Right, so the idea of here an industrial novelty taking biological organization by surprise, in a sense, is critical to understand the specific vulnerability of living beings that do not just stem from their systemic properties, but also from the fact that their organization comes from a history and thus is singular. Well, I will switch. I will skip this one, which is a bit more complex, and still emphasize that to me there is a second kind of disruption, which could be called second-order disruptions. So, in a sense, first-order disruptions are disruption of the result of history. They are the disruption of past novelties that play a critical role in biological organization. Now, second-order disruptions would be the disruption of the capacity to create novelty, and thus disruption of the capacity of biological objects to construct their history over time. And actually, there are examples of that, even though it's not that studied for various reasons. But a good example of that builds on a very standard neo-Darwinian framework is the disruption of evolution by natural selection due to habitat fragmentation. So what happens? Well, if you have a population of animals, let's say, and this population is fragmented. It does not need to shrink a lot. That is to say, it's not disappearance by brutal reduction of the habitat size. But if you have this population that gets fragmented, then, and by fragmentation, I mean that the different pockets of population cannot exchange, so they cannot reproduce between each other. So what happened is that in all the small pockets of population, you have a trend towards genetic homogeneity, and it's due to inbreeding. And if you have genetic homogeneity, then you cannot have a diversity that natural selection can act upon in order to lead over time to the selection of the fittest, for example, or things like that. So in this sense, adaptation by natural selection does not work in this case, and not, again, it's not due to just to a shrinkage of the population. Actually, the population does not need to shrink. It's the disruption of evolution by natural selection. But there are other cases in physiology or in cognitive sciences where you can really see disruption at this level, that is to say, the level of the ability to produce functional novelties. Now, of course, just to conclude on disruptions, all these disruptions, for example, the variety of endocrine disruptors, disruptions due to global warming, due to other chemicals, due to human activities, infrastructure, and so on, all these disruptions accumulate. And they lead to a situation where some ecosystems can completely collapse, which will probably be the case. And it's actually already the case for many coral reefs, where you have an addition of this factor. I didn't mention invasive species, which are also a factor of disruption in ecology. But it is also the case to an extent for human intelligence, because the technological changes that are the means by which we work intellectually. So the technological means by which we work intellectually are also changing very rapidly. And you may have observed, for example, that our ability to read is far weaker or far less good on a screen than on paper. And it's actually another example of disruption that neurologists have worked on. That is to say, the ability to read and to perform what is called deep reading in this field requires to establish decoding text as an automatism that is fast, and it doesn't work well with in the cases of dyslexia, where this ability is impaired. The point is that this ability requires exaptation of various brain areas, because reading is a very recent thing in human evolution. And because it requires this exaptation, reading is very fragile, which means that a change in the support of the text that you are reading can deeply alter your ability to read. So in a nutshell, the change of support, that is to say going from paper to a screen, can disrupt your ability to read by criticizing, by imagining stuff. So can disrupt this reading, deep reading. Sorry. So now I will conclude. So what I wanted to show you is that basically when we focus on living beings as they are today, historicity enters the pictures in a very fundamental way, so that we cannot even describe the objects of biology, of everyday biology, if you will, without historicity and without referring to the past. And with the case of disruption, what I wanted to show you was that you cannot even understand the vulnerabilities of current living beings without having this historical picture in mind. And therefore, historicity is fundamental to biology as such in general, and not just to the biology that focuses on understanding what happened in the past. And this aspect of thing is both a challenge and an opportunity, because it opens up new questions with respect to how, for example, we perform mathematical modeling. And that's it. So now we can discuss a bit more.
So I want to ask this question because I think that you have I think it seems to me that you like to integrate the different kinds of philosophical traditions as some kind of, background heuristic or something like that. So in that sense, what is kind of weird for me is that you didn't mention Whitehead. I mean, my knowledge of his system is pretty superficial because I only read him out of enjoyment, but it seems to be that he needed to cope with these issues that you mentioned since he eliminated the stability of this metaphysical notion of substance in Western philosophy and based his ontology on processes. So his system has this requirement of, inherent, tendency to be historical, and he has a problem, obviously, of explaining stability and generality and this property of being generic, and he needs to translate this to terminology and to create these notions of variability and creativity that as well in relation to this notion of new possibilities that you mentioned, because he thinks that the creativity of nature is essential for it. Thanks very much. I hope that I was clear enough.
Yes. Well, I didn't work specifically on Whitehead, but there are many philosophers that are involved in these questions. I worked more specifically on Bergson, Nietzsche, Canguilhem. But in all cases, what I try to do here is to show you how things can work in actual scientific practice. So I didn't talk about metaphysics at all, for example. I didn't even mention it. And I always took a very epistemological stance, either theoretical or epistemological. By theoretical, I mean theoretical biology, and trying to always articulate the two. So, for example, specific objects, yes, but how you name them. And Whitehead could not know the classification of living beings as it is now performed because it started in the 70s. ENIAC is that I presented last time is in the 70s. But to me, for example, there is the opportunity of doing work between this classification and Whiteheadian philosophy. But the step that ENIAC took, let's say, is a step further in, let's say, processual worldview of things. And at the same time, I'm a bit unhappy, and I'm not saying that for Whitehead at all, but when the focus is on metaphysics statements, saying that everything changes, for example, is a bit naive, because what matters is to construct, at least for me, is to construct a schema that enables you to understand things, to understand living beings, to understand a disease, to understand the description of living being in the Anthropocene, and so on. And for that, you need to specify things further. And again, to specify how things could work epistemologically and sometimes even mathematically, because I didn't talk about that, but in this case of description, there are some mathematical pitfalls. And so I brought you, I proposed you some concepts that have this purpose, that are built with this purpose in mind. The one of constraints, closure of constraints, key, which is Chi, which builds on the epistemology of the classification of living beings, and this concept of disruption, for example. And all of them are, in a sense, at the interface between relational and historical epistemology.
Sorry, can you please go back to the first diagram related to disruptions?
Sure. This one?
Yeah, that's it. So I was just wondering whether this process can be conceived as cyclical in a way, since this loss of viability can be specified as a loss of viability of one trait, not necessarily a whole function of an organism. So can this be a sort of, whole cycle of disruption through which some new viability can emerge?
Yes, I will stop sharing, except if you want to keep the diagram. So that
No, it's okay. You can stop sharing.
Because this way I can see you better. That's a very interesting point. And it's something that I didn't present. It's that, in a sense, living beings are always exposed to small disruptions, even at the level of an organism or at the level of lineages or population. And here disruptions are just randomization that disorganize them to an extent. And this disorganization can be the basis of the appearance of novelty. And I entirely agree with this view. At the same time, but it's something that is that I'm working with on, let's say. In the notion of disruption, there is something that goes a bit further. That is to say, it's not a slight disorganization, it's a significant disorganization. Now, living beings can sustain a significant disorganization and recover from it by one way or another. And actually, it's in medicine, it's called compensation, and it goes with decompensation. That's when the slight disorganization that could be fixed by the physiology can no longer be fixed by the living being. And this question goes hand in hand with the normativity of Canguilhem to go back on that. Now, what happens in the Anthropocene, and that's where the critical argument comes forth, is the accumulation of disruption, and that is straightforward, and that's the situation where living beings can no longer cope by building by generating novelties, functional novelties, and tend to disappear. And there is something similar going on with human society. That is to say, we can cope with a new technology or a few new technologies, but with the acceleration of technological innovations. And that's something that has been emphasized by the philosopher Bernard Stiegler. The means of regulation of society, such as instances on toxicity or on work regulation for Uber and so on, cannot perform their role anymore because changes are too fast, disruptions are too fast, and the society gets disorganized and a political mess ensues. So basically, I agree with you, and the key point for the Anthropocene is the accumulation of disruption and not just disruption by themselves. Which lead to another point is that, in my view, disruption as such, and not necessarily anthropogenic disruptions, are part of evolution and the natural process of evolution. And the dangerous part of the Anthropocene is really the accumulation of disruptions.
Great, thanks for a super detailed answer. And by the way, it was a really interesting lecture, so thanks.
Thank you very much.
I want to try to ask a question. I want to ask a question about the relationship between functions and disruptions. It even rhymes. I read about, theory of proper functioning, and proper functioning is a process that if some kind of historical development or evolution selected a trait to do some kind of function in the historical sense, if that part of our, body is proper functioning, then it means that it, works in the tune with that kind of historical process that selected that trait. And my question is, if we try to biologize cognition, and if we try to ask questions about proper functioning of cognitive processes, or what would be a disruption in that cognitive sense? Because I don't know, the meteorite hits the ground, and I don't know, there is a change in the habitat, and our bodies, evolve in a different way. And for cognition, maybe if something happens with the sun and there is no enough light, and we start to perceive things differently, or there is not enough oxygen in the atmosphere, and our brain needs oxygen, and we adapt, or some small amount of population adapt to the small amount of oxygen, and the other dies, that in that biological direct sense influences the cognitive functioning. But my question is, what would be disruptions in cognitive sense if we don't consider biological habitat and we consider some other kind of habitats like informational habitat or culture, I think the disruption in that sense would be very hard to grasp and to understand. And
Well,
no, please, Mael, you can answer me.
I can answer. It's
I'll just abuse the microphone. I'll jump in. So one possibility is to answer this question of disruption in that sense would be actually nutrition. It turns out that fairly slight changes in nutrition affect the size of the brain very substantially in terms of like 5 to 10%, which then has some measurable cognitive consequences in a population if you do that. So even nutrition is probably the kind of a disruptive property in that sense. And I mean, people to ask, these are archaeologists and anthropologists actually. So I don't think it would be very hard, but that's me. Now, Mael, please.
I don't know for nutrition because in a sense, it depends on the historical schema that you have in mind. Because in a sense, what happened is that the nutrition quality increased. Still, it's not great with in some regards, but increased in the last year, and in a sense, the brain in the last decades, and in a sense, the brain developed better than it did, let's say, 500 or 1,000 years ago, at least for the overall population. But it's not obvious whether it's a case with respect to the situation, let's say, 10,000 years ago, for example. Because with agriculture, there has been an impoverishment of a big part of the population. So in the middle, there has been a decrease. But there are two big disruptions that I can talk about. One is endocrine disruptors, and it's really the brain morphogenesis that get disrupted. It's even cellular differentiation, for example, cells that became neuron without the endocrine disruptor become other cell types, or myelinization. So it's ability of action potential to go far and fast in the brain that gets diminished. So that's very biological. Now there is another one that is very technological. I don't know whether I was clear about reading, but the idea is that reading is a fragile process. By fragile, I mean that when we all learn to read on paper, write on paper. And the idea is that just changing from paper to screens that have luminosity, that don't have the same affordances, so just this change changes our ability to read and to perform deep reading. And deep reading is really the ability to read, but at the same time to think critically or to imagine things, imagine pictures. If you're reading a novel, for example. So this ability of deep reading is impaired when reading on screens, luminous screens. And that's why maybe all of you or a part of you print paper before submitting it to read it once on paper, precisely. So that's something that we all feel actually intuitively. And now we can talk about disruption at the society level. That is to say, if everybody reads less well than before, because everybody is reading on screens, that we have a situation where debate is impoverished. And so debates become more shallow. and then politics becomes a complete mess. And that's emphasized by the algorithms that are used in social media that put forward primarily those things that are stimulating response rapidly. So you have a regression of politics that is due in part to these technologies and the disruption of deep reading that take place more easily, let's say, on paper. Now, what I mean by that is not a demonization of digital technologies, but the fact that we need to relearn how to read with screens first, and a way to facilitate, let's say, critical reading on screens is to do annotations, for example, on PDF. That's a way to keep the focus that is easily lost when reading on screen. But there is a work to do for that. And again, conceptually, what does it mean to do work or to relearn how to read, and also to relearn learning methods on how to read, because we have methods to teach how to read on paper, and those methods emerged with writing, but we don't have methods to teach how to read on screens, right? Because in a sense, a lot of people thought that it would be the same than to read on paper. So there is a lot of work to, again, go back to or find singular situations where functionality is restored in a sense, and enhanced too, because the change of technology has its uses. Of course, a lot of things that you can do on a screen that you cannot do with paper.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I'm boring, but I have just one comment, if I may. Thank you. I think that cognition should be partly subject of investigation in biology, but I think there are a lot of problems if we try to use the concept from biology and implement them in cognition investigations, because there is a philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, that say, so if you don't believe in God, your cognitive functions are not working properly. And I think we can, I don't know, create a lot of that kind of theories, and we can widen them. And I think there is a conceptual problem with using concept of function in cognitive research, but I don't know. That is just a comment, maybe stupid. Thank you very much for your lovely lecture. And if anyone online have a question, you can ask.
If not, I think we are over time already. So thank you very much. Well, once again, this was great. And see you soon when we are in under. Thanks.